What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Geek Pantheon. I am Eric, and today we are going to discuss world building. Now, there are a ton of videos out there that discuss the beginnings of building your own homebrew world. I've done some similar videos in that vein before as well, where we talk about building out your nations, the pantheon of gods, etc. But I wanted to go to the next level of once you have that baseline documentation of your world, what can you do for the next step to make the world truly feel lived in and like a living, breathing thing? So let's get into it. First and foremost, if you are creating a homebrew fantasy world, the first thing that you have to ask yourself is, what impact does magic have on your world? Obviously, if you're running a tabletop role-playing game that has a magic system, magic exists, which means the world on some very fundamental levels is going to be vastly different than the world that we currently live in, regardless of what age or era you're setting it in. The Bronze Age, as it existed in our world, is going to be vastly different in a world where magic exists, just like our current day in 2023 would be vastly different if it had magic. So take some time to think about the various spells that exist within the system that you're using and how that would impact the day-to-day lives of the people living in that world from top to bottom. This is obviously going to play into things like classism as well. How does magic impact people's station within society? Are powerful magic users those who rule? Is magic this revered thing that propels people to the top of industries and organizations? Or is it something that's feared and people shun and shy away from? So the more powerful magic user you are, the lower downcast you are, the more likely you are to be locked up and thrown away in a dark dungeon somewhere. And does this vary from nation to nation? Is there one nation where magic is an integral part of their society, where their major city, the primary power source, is arcane? Whereas another nation who is more fearful of magic, perhaps they cast people out, and so this other nation becomes a refuge for people that have magical abilities in this other nation. You can create some really interesting dynamics if you think about the role of magic in your world. While we're thinking about how magic integrates into our society, we also have to look at the other part of a growing and functioning society that progresses forward: technology. How does technology integrate with your society and your homebrew world that you're creating? When I say technology, I'm not talking about smartphones. I'm talking about wheels and tools and things like that, where you get down to that base level and then progress forward. Magic is going to disrupt industry and technological progress in a major way. And so thinking about what technology that exists in our world still exists in your homebrew setting and why it still exists. Obviously, the biggest one that I think is discussed more than any other piece of technology when it comes to fantasy, especially medieval fantasy settings, is black powder. There are a lot of people on both sides of the argument saying if you can cast fireball or firebolt or even magic stone, why would you need black powder? Why would you need to develop that technology when you have magic that can replicate literally everything that black powder can do, but in a more controlled way? Potential. Whereas on the other side of things, if you have a world where not everyone has access to magic, then this can be a great equalizer. The introduction of black powder could be a huge moment in your world, because all of a sudden all these people that can't cast firebolt or fireball or magic stone can do a lot of the same things now via technology. And this comes down to how magic works and integrates with technology in your setting. In a world like Eberron, where magic can be used to create items that can replicate these style of spells and then given to somebody that does not have an innate magical ability, then it becomes less likely that something like black powder may come to fruition, because magic can be used in a way that can be turned into an industry and sold to people. Magic can be commercialized. Whereas in a world more like Forgotten Realms, where the casters are the ones that have the magic and it's harder to transfer that power to other users, it makes much more sense that something like black powder would come along. So thinking about these questions can go a long way into making your world feel like something truly unique and special, wholly separated from our world, because you're taking into consideration how magic and technology interact with one another. Now, when you're developing a homebrew setting, obviously you're going to establish continents, nations, and you might begin to develop the various cultures and how all these places are different from one another. But an aspect of that I don't see a whole lot of people dive deep into because it's boring is economics and the trade systems between nations. But while it may come across as boring, it's actually not if you get into some of the stuff that's happened in our world as a result of economics and trade systems. In fact, it can get really depressing really quick. But looking at your various nations and the climates that exist within those nations and think about, okay, what would they be able to produce? What would they have an abundance of that they could ship out to other nations? And what would those nations need and be able to ship back? Can create an interesting web that you can build some fascinating intrigue on. If you are wanting to run a globetrotting intrigue espionage-esque campaign, building out the economics and trade systems of your world will give you such fertile land to plant your campaign in. Because when people's food is on the line, they're going to go to drastic measures to ensure that those trade systems, those trade routes, those things stay established. Additionally, when people's gold is on the line, they're going to start wars over that. So establishing what are the precious commodities in your world that people are willing to kill for in order to make sure that those trade systems continue flowing. And if we go back to the technology and magic conversation, maybe this nation over here that has their major city that is powered by magic, maybe there's a resource that is consumed in order to keep the magic flowing, a material component that is needed for the power system in this city. And maybe this other nation that is more fearful of magic has an abundance of that component because they don't cast magic that much. And so now this nation that reveres magic has to establish a trade system with this nation that fears magic. And how does that work? What does that look like? And that can be an interesting aspect of your world. Your answer shouldn't be, it doesn't, because even though this nation fears magic, they can make a lot of money by shipping out this commodity that this nation needs for their power system. So they have the upper hand here. And so now you can start thinking about, what does that trade system look like? How do the economics change if, let's say, nation C over here all of a sudden discovers, oh, we also have an abundance of this commodity, and we're not as fearful of magic, so we're willing to be more helpful with this nation. Nation A, the fearful one, is going to absolutely go to war with Nation C in order to keep their trade line open and keep money coming into their coffers. Economics and trade can be really interesting in your world, so take some time to think about how those relationships and dynamics can inform the conflicts going on in your homebrew setting. One of the first things that most people do when they're developing a homebrew setting for a fantasy world is they develop their pantheon of gods. It's one of the coolest, most exciting things. You get to flex your creative muscles because gods in the pantheon aren't restricted by the normal things that like a nation and a king or a queen or a duke will be restricted by because they are mortals. You get to really go crazy with the gods in your pantheon. And I know a lot of homebrew settings that began with the gods in mind. But people stop too soon a lot of times when they're developing their pantheon. They develop the pantheon and they have a very Greco-Roman idea of gods come down and directly influence and can step in and punch each other, and the player characters have to deal with these forces of nature. But the gods are worshipped by people who establish religions and temples and shrines and cathedrals in their honor. So I would argue the least interesting thing about your pantheon of gods is the gods themselves and the power that they can exert on the world. The much more interesting thing is, how do people interact with each other when their view of these gods differ? And I'm not just talking about somebody that worships the lawful god of commerce and the trickster god that is the benevolent overseer of thieves and rogues, and how those two followers like hate each other and interact. I'm talking about the followers of the trickster god of thieves and rogues and the divisions that happen within that god's sphere of influence, of the people that think that the trickster god is actually a god of benevolence, and their teachings indicate that we should subvert established organizations of power who take advantage of people that cannot fight for themselves. And so we should steal from them in order to benefit the the people that need help within our society, as opposed to the other ones. Like, no, the trickster god is just a god of chaos, and you got to get yours while you can get it. And so it doesn't matter who you steal from. You just need to steal in order to revere the trickster god. How would those two sects begin to fight and interact with each other? And this can be an interesting thing in your city. You can scale it way down to where the party's rogue is the one that believes in the benevolence of the trickster god. And like, you steal in order to benefit others, and you steal from the rich and give to the poor, Robin Hood. And they come up against the Thieves Guild, which is the other type of worship of the trickster god. And how does that conflict fuel itself through the worship of this god? And then if you want to have the Greco-Roman style, what does the god think about this? What do they have to say about how these people are worshiping them? And even if the god directly contradicts the worshipers of one of these sects, do they actually change their ways? Or do they think, no, they're trying to subvert or throw people off the trail or something? It's very fascinating stuff, and you can really get a lot of mileage out of thinking about your god's influence on people and how people use their worship of this god to fuel their own ambitions and drives. There's a phenomenal conversation with Brennan Lee Mulligan that I saw recently where he talks about, I think this was a philosophy professor of his, that talks about the fact that people don't have ideologies that inform their personality. They have a personality that informs their ideology. You do not worship the trickster. The Thieves Guild does not steal from everybody with no regard for their station in society because they worship this sect of the trickster god that says steal from everybody, get what you can while you can. They worship the trickster god in that way because they want to be able to steal from whoever they can. So think about the personalities of the people in your societies, the cultural personalities of these nations, and how that would inform which god they worship and how they worship them. Because that flow is much more interesting than saying, we worship this god this way, therefore we act this way. The conversation being, we act this way, so we find the god that fits what we want to do. And then if you have that Greco-Roman style, how does that god feel about it? Do they petition the party to go to this nation that has built their identity around the worship of them in a twisted, malevolent form and say, hey, you need to go fix that because I'm not cool with this, but at the same time, I can't just go smite their city because that wouldn't be cool either. I'm sure there's people in that city that don't actually think this way, and it's just the leadership that's manipulating them. So go figure out what's going on and fix it. That can be an interesting adventure or even campaign. If you're building a homebrew setting that has a long history, then you really need to consider what has happened in the past that has created a unique set of challenges and conflicts in your world for the player characters to come up against long term. Great example in my homebrew setting that I've talked about before in the Setting Roulette video on the channel. One of the players introduced the idea that gravity doesn't work correctly. And so I took that, and when I was building out the setting, said that basically in the 1,000 years in the past, when there was a revolution against these oppressive gods, they managed to kill a subset of these gods whose power is what fueled gravity, essentially. And so with their death, gravity became an unreliable entity in this world, to where you can be walking along and all of a sudden you gain 50 pounds from gravity becoming this oppressive force, or you begin to float through the air because gravity goes away for a bit. And it's like weather patterns. They move about in that way. And there are sections of the world that, hey, don't go there. Gravity's crazy. Like Tornado Alley in the US. Don't go there. I live there because it's crazy. So think about what aspects of your world have had this kind of long-term effect from previous conflicts or actions of player characters, like heroes of the ages previous or the pantheon of gods, those kind of things. What kind of big impacts have they had on the world? Is there a huge fissure through your continent from the time that the god of war was fighting the god of death and their sword came down and sliced through the earth, leaving this giant fissure of death and destruction and fiery pits at the bottom? Or a homebrew setting that I've been working on for quite some time with my buddy Philip, who's on the Eberron Renewed podcast and Kyber Shards, etc., is this idea of a setting where it's like the Age of Enlightenment, where you have the arcane and divine established powers that very much gatekeep magic, and they think it's this learned thing that should be controlled. And then you have psionics that wake up and become this force of innate magic, that they just have it. It's theirs to control, and a huge war breaks out. And the campaign setting has the players after this war has happened in a Cold War-esque setting. But there is a section of the world that I don't even remember if we came up with a pithy title, but essentially the Deadlands, where the arcane users tried to come up with their own brand of healing because they didn't want to be wholly reliant on their divine allies. And necromancy was born and went awry. And so now there's this section of the world in between these two nations that's just gray mist and zombies and wights and ghosts, because the arcane wizards unleashed their full force of necromancy in this section of the world, and it devastated it, and the necromantic energy never went away. And lastly, encourage player-driven world building. This is the biggest thing that I will give to all my fellow GMs out there. If you want your players invested in your world, give them a sense of agency and control over it. What I do in my homebrew setting for my home game is when players make an arcana, religion, history check, whatever, I ask them what their character knows before they make the roll. And I don't lead them anywhere. You're investigating this mural on the wall. What does your character know about what this mural has? And they establish that, and then they roll. If they succeed, they have established that part of the world. If they fail, it's a misconception their character has. So we're still building something even on a failure. We're building stereotypes and misconceptions about people, things, places through their character's lens. So now we know, because this character failed this check, that Drow, for some reason, have this prejudice against this thing and think it's a certain way, or at least the Drow from their nation and where they come from. So it's a very cool way to allow the players to influence the building of the world in both a concrete way and a cultural way. But if you are starting a brand new homebrew setting with the first campaign and the players are your initial players for this world, absolutely let them establish places, organizations, notable people as part of their backstory, and take what they give you and incorporate it into your world, because you will find that they will be that much more invested in the aspects of the world that they had a hand in. If the idea of this setting roulette type world building, where I let the players introduce aspects of the world at session 0, is intriguing to you, then check out the video right there.